It is episode 10 of the Onside CFL Fantasy Football Podcast. As usual, Lower Your Weapons by Revolution Engine, the band of our engineer, Ben Bussey, bringing it in for us, as they do each and every week. Producer Dan Heinmarsh is on site as well. Dave Dawson, Dan the Stats Guy, we're available on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, and YouTube as well, if you hadn't heard of that before. What was that sound? Did Engineer Ben just fall off a cliff? Oh, hang on, wait. He looks to be okay. Might have just had a broken leg. Dan the Stats Guy, what a busy weekend of injuries in the CFL.
Yeah, add Engineer Ben to the list of injuries there. It seemed like every game there was a couple guys going down. We've talked about it last week and in the weeks before, guys getting added to the six-game injured list, and now that list continues to grow across the CFL with a number of major injuries to a number of star players.
Yeah, and you want to be aware of that as you're subscribing to our weekly DFS rankings, which are out on Tuesdays. You can check out onsidecfl.wordpress.com. Let's get right into the injuries because, wow, were there ever a lot of them on the weekend. The best news, I guess, if you're a Calgary Stampeders fan, the first three we'll get to. On the receiving side, Lamar Durant, sprained ankle. Looks like he's going to be back. He was practicing on the weekend.
Yeah, he practiced on Saturday and again on Monday as well. Simone Charbonneau-Campeau has filled in the past 2 weeks for Durant at that slot back position. Also, one player, unfortunately, that's gone down, doesn't look like he's going to be able to go this week, is Joe West, the weak side receiver, who sprained his ankle or had kind of an ankle injury before the bye week, went through the bye, and doesn't look like he's going to be ready to go. Greg Wilson, a player that was with Stampeders last season, and Tavares Daniels, a player who's spent some time in the NFL, are going to be the two guys that are going to be probably the one of which will be a starter for the Stampeders against Winnipeg this week. Neither player is available on DraftKings, so with that, if you're in a long format league, you're going to want to look at those guys. But unfortunately for DraftKings, you're going to have to wait a week. And the third one, Anthony Parker missed practice on Monday as well, and Simone Charbonneau-Campeau would then shift out to that, as it needs to be a Canadian that starts at that position for the Stampeders. So one bit of good news for the Stampeders, but Parker's going to be one that you're going to have to watch for, whether he's going to be in the lineup against the Blue Bombers, but definitely Joe West, it looks like he's going to be out.
So if you're looking at cut and bait of Simone Charbonneau-Campeau, no need to do that yet. You'll be able to get a couple more weeks out of him if you're in a long format or a DraftKings format as well. Bad news, if you're in long format for a defensive side, a defensive end, Frank Beltre might not be around this week.
Yeah, he missed practice on Monday and was in a walking boot on his foot. So according to head coach Dave Dickinson, he's questionable for the game against Winnipeg. Jagara Davis, a rookie, would start in his place on the defensive line.
Quinn Smith, he'll be out of action as well this week. Junior Turner did practice. He was on the sixth game. He had off-season shoulder surgery, so will they bring him off early? Not sure. Derek Wiggins started for Quinn Smith last week, but now he's hurt. So that could produce a bit of a problem for Calgary. As Taylor Reed, the best news of the week, though, if you're a Calgary Stampeders fan, pardon me, not the best news of the week. Taylor Reed still might not be able to be back for game action this week, as they were hoping to have him before, but Alex Singleton will probably step in his place.
Yeah, he missed practice on Monday, and Duron Mayo did practice, so it looks like he'll be good to go, but some injuries starting to pile up on the Stampeders defense. Micah Johnson was sick again on Monday with the flu. He missed practice, so they've had a pile of injuries go through Calgary. And usually when you come out of the bye week, you're hoping to get a lot of guys back, but the injuries have kept going, and so they may have to do something like bringing Junior Turner off the 6-game injured list just to get a strong lineup against Winnipeg.
The good news is they are playing the Bombers. Okay, Winnipeg fans, we're just kidding. But the Bombers will be missing a pretty big weapon this week. Ryan Smith, an upper body injury, should be out for a couple of weeks, according to head coach Mike O'Shea, and expect a couple of different bodies to fight for that position.
Yeah, Thomas Mayo earlier in the season was the guy that had filled in when Weston Dressler was down. Another name to watch for that potentially, maybe not this week, but maybe in weeks going forward, is Gerard Shepherd. He actually was in the Bombers lineup last week in the game that I forget who they even played against Edmonton.
Edmonton, yeah.
Gerard Shepherd dressed for that game, so they're seeing what he can do. He's a fairly big receiver, and so to replace someone like Ryan Smith in the slot back, it might not be the right fit with that. Shepherd probably would go to one of the outside receiver spots, as he's a 6'2", 211-pound receiver. But for now, Thomas Mayo looks like he's going to be the guy to go. Again, Mayo's not on DraftKings, so Shepherd is. If you see something that indicates that maybe as the week goes on, they might go with Shepherd, that $3,000 value suddenly comes into play with Shepherd. But for now, the way it's sounding, that they're going to go with Mayo.
And on the special team side, Quincy McDuffie, listed as a wide receiver, also the kick returner, may be in action for this week, this Thursday. Not totally sure yet. Mike O'Shea says he's hopeful to have him in the lineup. He did miss last week's action in the kick return spot for the Bombers, and a big spot on defense that Winnipeg fans really want to have back. Johnny Adams, he's close to returning, but still not yet.
Yeah, CJ Roberts will get the start again at that corner. He didn't do a terrible job. Just gave up a couple of big plays to Darrell Walker, but for now, Johnny Adams remains out of the lineup.
And the Ottawa Red Blacks, Forrest Hightower, head injury. He did practice on Monday, however, not sure if he'll be in action this weekend. And a big offseason, or big signing from a guy who we had high expectations for in the offseason, could make an impact in the secondary.
Yeah, it may not be this week, but Mitchell White was signed by the Red Blacks prior to this week. He, of course, was cut by the Montreal Alouettes prior to the season. He could be kind of a shutdown guy for the Red Blacks at the corner, but they have options there also with Tristan Jackson on the corner.
And Jarrell Gavins, who suffered a leg injury last week, week 4, looks like he should be good to go this week. And we did note Brandon Sermons was released this past weekend as well. So some changes in the Ottawa secondary. Moving to the Riders, probably the biggest infirmary over the weekend, and some big names that I know a lot of fans in Saskatchewan, if our American listeners who are new to the CFL, Rider Nation is loud and proud in the CFL, and their star quarterback, Darian Durant, another ankle injury, but the news looks to be good out of the green and white.
Yeah, that sigh of relief you heard after the game when the tweets started coming out, that originally we had actually tweeted out from one of the radio guys with the Rough Riders that initial word was a broken ankle, and then a few minutes later another tweet came out that it was a sprained ankle. Doesn't look like it's going to be very long-term for Durant. He actually completed one more pass to Rob Bagg for the long touchdown prior to leaving, but with this, Mitchell Gale will get the start against the Red Blacks on Friday night, and there's not really a timetable for a return for Durant going forward.
Matt Walter at running back looked like he left the game early, and he just hasn't been getting a lot of touches. Saw a little bit of action last week against the BC Lions, but mainly because of his national status. He sees a couple of touches there, so there's a bit of a hole on the running back side. And John Childs, not a severe injury like he's faced in the past in his career with the Argos, but he could be not available this week, and a guy that a lot of fans in Saskatchewan are excited to see could step in for him.
Well, Monty Edwards is the guy. He's been on the active roster but hasn't actually dressed for a game yet this season, and many people may know him as the former starting quarterback at Appalachian State, who had a miracle game that they beat Michigan in I'm guessing almost 10 years ago now. He was the quarterback for the team, and it was completely a long shot that Appalachian State won the game. He went and turned pro with the Carolina Panthers as a receiver and a kick returner, and we've talked about a number of players that have been kick returners in the NFL that have come up and had major success in the CFL. And in the case of John Childs with the Rough Riders, it's kind of interesting, the word that they've sent out outside of Durant, and in the case of Matt Walter and John Childs and Shamad Chambers, who we'll also get to, and Brendan Labatt and Justin Cox, they're all undisclosed injuries. And that's one thing that you're going to watch for with Chris Jones. He likes to keep things very secretive. He's actually talked to Rider fans at the end of training camp and indicated he doesn't want them tweeting out anything. If they come to watch practice, he wants to have that cone of silence around the Rough Riders this year. So not really anything as far as any kind of major updates on Monday as far as injuries go. Hopefully as the week goes on, we can get some.
And that's Eskimos fans. We'll listen to that and go, yep, that sounds familiar. Chris Jones likes to run a tight ship. And as Dan mentioned, Shamad Chambers' hamstring left the game on Saturday. Dembski came in. caught a touchdown on that level, and a couple of offensive line injuries that are listed here. We mainly say that because of the ability to be able to run the ball, and Brandon Labatt and Dan Clark are two big names in Saskatchewan.
Yeah, Labatt at the left guard and Dan Clark the center. Curtis Steele didn't have a whole lot of success against BC in week 4, and one of those things is having those guys out of the lineup, not being able to push the pile. So that'll affect Curtis Steele going forward, and it'll also affect the amount of time that Mitchell Gale has in the pocket.
And there's also another defensive line injury and a lot of new faces in Saskatchewan. A 70% turnover from the bodies from last year, which is reason why that there could be hope in Saskatchewan in weeks ahead. And S.A. Murbury, did I pronounce that right? If you're listening, I hope I got that one right.
That's exactly how Chris Cuthbert pronounced it on the weekend. Murbury, a guy who came over from the BC Lions, also left the game on Saturday. He, of course, into a backup role after starting the game in Edmonton. No update on his status as well.
Justin Cox had a fantastic game last week against the Eskimos and was a thorn in the side to green and gold receivers all night long. Left the game on Saturday. Tavon Campbell, Johnny Dixon, a couple of bodies that came in there didn't fare too well, but for Saskatchewan fans, you'd hope Justin Cox can get in there quickly. And I guess
and I'll just jump in there. Johnny Dixon would come off the practice roster. Tavon Campbell was obviously burned on a couple of big plays. A lot of it having to do with the ratio for that game, and they kind of touched on that during the broadcast. Dixon has been in the lineup for the Riders before, so the hope would be that he'd be able to fill in and there wouldn't be as much of a drop-off.
Ratio will be big problems in weeks ahead for the Riders as they do face ailing bodies and not a whole lot of depth in that Canadian position. And obviously, we've spoken in weeks past about the ratio and the difference that makes in the roster. And you need to have the Canadians and the Americans. As producer Dan is waving his arms frantically going, "Can you explain the ratio one more time for us?" So those of you who are new to the CFL game, that's how the situation goes. On the Hamilton side of things, only one injury, and one that you're normally pretty, you'd expect a guy like this. He's got some talent, but CJ Gable in years past has been known to get injured here and there. This one hopefully isn't too serious.
They looked at his neck in the fourth quarter of that game, took him out for a little bit of action. In this case, the Ticats, as far as depth go, Ross Shireman is on the practice roster. He would be the next man up for the Ticats, but I don't think this is serious enough that Gable would come out. There wasn't much after the game in terms of any buzz towards the injury, so expect Gable to be in the lineup for the Hamilton Tiger Cats in Week 5 against the Edmonton Eskimos.
And those Eskimos only had one injury on the weekend and a big one. Almondo Sewell, left hip. He left the game in the fourth quarter. National defensive lineman Eddie Steele came in his favor, so keep your eyes peeled there for long-format fantasy players over Almondo Sewell, and especially even DraftKings, because he is quite the shutdown guy down the middle in encouraging great run defense.
Yeah, he kind of takes on the double teams for the Edmonton Eskimos and allows for the outside guys and Marcus Howard and Odell Willis to race to the quarterback. That could affect the pass rush as far as the Edmonton Eskimos go against Hamilton, especially when you consider who's throwing the ball for the Ticats and Jeremiah Masoli. If Masoli has time in the pocket, like we saw in Week 1, he can fling the ball out and put some yards up. But when he's hurried and he isn't able to get the ball out, he tends to struggle and turn the ball over.
We'll get to that when we get into our matchups. And the Montreal Alouettes, a team that did struggle last week because this guy was out of the lineup, many would say. A lot would say maybe it's because of the offensive schemes. We'll get to that too. But Kevin Glenn, ankle and an eye injury last week, and they split duty to the Alouettes at quarterback last week.
Well, it's looking like Kevin Glenn will see the field in Week 5 against the Toronto Argonauts. He practiced on Monday with the Montreal Alouettes, and he gives them the best chance to win of any of the quarterbacks that they currently have healthy. So expect Glenn to get the start and for Cato and Vernon Adams to remain on the bench.
Bear Woods, he's starting to develop that. It's unfortunate. One of the most exciting players to watch in the CFL. He's starting to develop that injury-prone moniker, and he did miss practice on Monday, but there could be good news because they don't play for another week.
Yeah, they have until next Monday, the rare Monday night football game in the CFL. We don't usually see many games on that night, so the Alouettes have an extra few days to rest up Bear Woods, and according to Coach Jim Popp, he's expected to play.
Toronto Argonauts, a weird one. A lot of you on DraftKings and a lot of long format fantasy owners had this guy, Torrey Gurley. You had him dressed. You were watching the game going, where's Torrey Gurley? Where is he? It was kind of a weird situation. He was dressed, but he didn't play. And word came out that he had an ailing injury, I think, towards the end of the game.
Yeah, he had a back injury, and so Torrey Gurley actually went to head coach Scott Milanovic and said that he wasn't going to be good to go. In that case, Wallace Miles shifted to the outside receiver spot. Phil Bates, who was expected to start anyways at slot back, got most of the snaps as well at slot back. So the Argonauts went to a lot of heavier passing to Kenny Shaw, and he was the beneficiary of that.
Down the middle, Corey Greenwood, hand injury. Huge linebacking hole there. If he's not able to go for the game next week, that'll be a big, big hole for the Argos. Thomas Miles would get the start, and it looks like the ratio should be okay because of the passports there.
Yeah, Corey Greenwood, there was no update after practice, so there's no timetable as far as whether he comes back. But again, they don't play till Monday, so a little bit of time for Greenwood to get ready.
Kwasi Owusu-Ansah, a guy that a lot of long-format fantasy owners fell in love with. Torn pectoral muscle, gone for the season. That's bad news for the Argos. Aaron Barry started for him last week, and the depths-wise, looks like Devin Smith will probably shuffle in there, making his return back again to the Argos, and good to have him in the lineup. And he's a cover guy that I think that doesn't get enough respect, but a guy like Kwasi Owusu-Ansah is a big shutdown corner. The BC Lions, Jeremiah Johnson, ankle injury, missed week 3 and 4. Anthony Allen stepped in there for him respectfully. And the Lions obviously are on bye week this week. Hopefully should give them enough time to be able to have him healthy again. But you got a bit of a problem when you're in BC. We might be able to talk about this later or now, but what do you do going forward from there?
Well, and that's the situation that Wally Buono has to look at. And there has been talk that they would start or dress both in training camp. They had them sort of as 1A, 1B and went with Johnson early in the season. If both are ready to go after the bye week, you could see some creativity to their offense with both guys in there.
Nick Moore, a funny injury if you watch the game on Saturday, celebrating after a pretty nice touchdown catch in the end zone, tweaked his knee, missed part of the game, but he did come back. And DraftKings fans and long-format fantasy owners are kind of falling in love with Nick Moore, who's not really a primary target in BC, but he does see a good amount of targets. And hopefully, Lions fans, after the bye week, will be happy to have him back in the lineup. But one guy who is going to be out of the lineup, and this is a huge hole, easily on pace to be one of the defensive players of the year in BC.
Yeah, TJ Lee tears his Achilles. He had to be carried off the field late in the game on Saturday. Word came out after the game, sort of towards midnight. Yeah, he has a torn Achilles. He'll miss the remainder of the season. If I guess there's a silver lining in all of this for the BC Lions, they have Stephen Clark, who was an outstanding cornerback for them last season, ready to go into their secondary. He, of course, left the Lions, went for a try with into the NFL, I believe with Jacksonville. I might be wrong with that as far as the team goes. Gets released from that, comes back from the Lions, and actually was beat out by Lucius Purifoy in training camp. And so he's been a backup for the Lions since the start of the season. He'll fill in for Lee, but obviously Lee, not an easy guy to replace either.
Top value players for the week. We'll breeze right through these. And BC Lions, you'd think Travis Lulay was irreplaceable at one point in time after leading the 2011 Grey Cup. However, there's another guy in town, John Jennings. Quarterback controversy, what? After week number 3? Jennings came in, put up 40.16 points against the Riders last week. Made a lot of fantasy owners happy. Mike Riley, over 400 yards passing, close to 500 yards, 30.4 points. Out of the backfield, CJ Gable, a bit of a surprising one. The Hamilton Ticats don't normally run the ball, but they were able to in garbage time last week, 21.95. Brandon Whitaker at 19.2. Greg Ellingson, massive game, 36.8. Adarius Bowman was being Adarius, as was Darrell Walker at 31.5 and 31.4 respectively. Sean Gore, 25.9 for the Lions. Naaman Roosevelt, normal category for him. He's going to be in the top receivers each and every week, 24.2. And the Hamilton Tiger Cats defense at 22 points last week against a very, very confused Montreal Alouettes offense. Top value players for week number 4, breaking that down. Jonathan Jennings, right there, Dan, the stats guide, $7,700. Boy, did he ever bring home the bacon.
Yeah, we had talked about it last week on the podcast and kind of between ourselves as well. In the case of Jonathan Jennings and with Travis Lule, of course, came in that Toronto game in relief of Jennings. He just wasn't getting the job done, and we had kind of seen if he wasn't going to get off to a good start in Saskatchewan, you could see Wally Buono ready to pull the cord and put in Lule, the veteran quarterback. Jennings had a couple of tough series to start, but it seemed like once the second half got going and the injuries started to pile up for Saskatchewan, Jonathan Jennings got into a little bit of a rhythm and started flinging the ball out. And yeah, he had a really good game, 40 points at that $7,700 value. If you had him, especially coming into the week where there was a question mark of whether he was even going to last the week, it was a bit of a gamble, but it paid off for you in a big way.
And early on in the game, he looked like he was having a little bit of trouble, but he found his way through that Riders defense somehow, and he got rewarded. CJ Gable in Hamilton, $5,200. This one is out of nowhere. I'm sorry, no disrespect to Gable, who does have a lot of talent, but we never saw this coming with the way the Hamilton Ticats offense is set up.
Well, and you know what? This is one of those things I kind of thought about this afternoon. And in the case of CJ Gable here, maybe this was a little bit predictable because the Hamilton Ticats defense in the previous week had turned the ball over. Masoli, it seemed like, was fumbling every other snap in the second half and really struggling to get anything going as far as an offense. We had talked about that Kent Austin was going to tell Masoli the number one thing is ball control and making sure that they protect the ball and not turn it over. And it made sense for them to use CJ Gable. Obviously, as was discussed on that broadcast, Zach Collaros is just a couple weeks away. The Ticats play this week, then they go into their bye week, and it looks like Collaros will come in the following week. So in that case, the Ticats probably will go a little bit more back to that pass-happy offense. But in the case of with that Montreal game, especially once they got a lead there, they were feeding Gable the ball on the ground, and he led the entire CFL in touches in week number 4.
And for as long as Trevor Harris is going to be a quarterback with the Ottawa Redblacks, it looks like he's developed a relationship with Greg Ellingson and a trust. So going forward, numbers for Greg will likely continue. $7,300, 36.8 points. Massive game for Ellingson last week, and that'll likely... He'll kind of take away some of that pressure from Chris Williams to perform each and every week, and the more attention Williams get. As if you listened to the show last week, there were fans coming down from the stands. Your aunt in Windsor, everybody was on Chris Williams, and it looked like it finally got to him.
Well, and you know what? And I think that was one where they really started to concentrate on Chris Williams, and the balls went to Greg Ellingson as he had a huge week. A couple of big catch and runs, a lot of yards after the catch. He right up there with the leaders for the week as far as yak yards in the CFL. And second place, Sean Gore. One big play again that put him into that second place for value at a $5,000 value. Gore, they took advantage of a mismatch on the outside, went after the young Tavon Campbell, the Canadian, and Gore was wide open down the sideline for the long touchdown.
And week in and week out, people are going to fall in love with Sean Gore, so just be more aware of the matchups, and we'll get there in a few minutes, but that is what you should focus on most for Sean Gore. He's got talent, but he's not going to be a primary target each and every week. Like this guy, who in a couple of weeks, his fantasy value is going to plummet through the floor, but in the meantime, he had a pretty good weekend at $4,300. Kenny Shaw, 16.4 points.
Thank you, Tori Gurley, with the injury. As I previously mentioned, Kenny Shaw got a pile of targets, 11 targets and 7 catches on the night, and that $4,300 value. Had we known that Gurley was going to be out of the lineup, obviously Shaw would have had that much more value, but it wasn't known until the kickoff had happened that Gurley was out of the lineup.
Corey Watson in Edmonton, 15.8 points, $4,200. A product of Mike Riley just having a time against the Bombers defense, who've been on the field since 1923, it seemed like, and hadn't had a chance to get off. Having a heyday. Brian Burnham in BC, another guy that week in and week out will be reliable at $4,100 for 15.3 points.
Yeah, breakout game for Brian Burnham. He's someone that Jennings used on a few deep routes down the middle of the field, and I think he's going to be a strong play going forward in that BC offense.
Rory Collert, now and then, Drew Willie does like to look to him. 14 points, caught himself a touchdown at $3,400. And the Ottawa Red Blacks defense, the top value player of the week at 11 points for $4,400. Not too shabby in that one as well. Biggest disappointments of the week seems week in and week out. We continually allude to this man, and no disrespect to his skill. I know he had a fantastic NCAA career, and we like to pick on him now and then, but he's mainly warm in the seat for Zach Claros, Jeremiah Mazzoli. If you paid $8,900 for him, you only got 8.12 points.
Yeah, and he did. I guess on the positive side, he didn't turn the ball over, and he did enough to give the Ticats the victory. But again, it's going to be a situation for him. He's going to be a game manager for the Ticats anytime he's in there. We saw in week 1, he was able to get it done by being a little bit more aggressive, but it hasn't worked in past weeks. And I think for Kent Austin, is just get through these weeks, play strong defense, get turnovers, and try to win it with a little bit more of a short game and a conservative approach on offense.
Couple of running back disappointments this week. No steal of a deal in Saskatchewan, Curtis Steele, $5,900. Only 1 point, but we did talk about that on the podcast last week. If Mikhail Brooks was down the middle, he'd be clotheslining and hitting everybody in the kneecaps. Just kidding. That one was for our friends in Saskatchewan. No, Mikhail Brooks, fantastic interior defensive lineman, makes a big difference against the run game, and he was able to shut it down big time, being the lineup last week.
1 point on the ground and then a couple points through the air for a 3-point total. But yeah, again, we had touched on that last week. If Brooks is going to be in, there wasn't going to be much for Curtis Steele.
John White only 8.8 points, and that we were a bit surprised by that one against a Bombers defense who are usually pretty susceptible. However, the Eskimos didn't really stay consistent to the run, and they just wanted to spread the ball around to their receivers. So $7,500, if you paid that much for White, you weren't a happy camper.
Yeah, in past weeks, the Edmonton offense has been a little bit more balanced, and it seemed early in that game they really stuck to the air, didn't run the ball a whole lot in that first half, and got into that position, and then suddenly in the second half when they got up, White got a little bit more. But I think for them going forward, a key to them getting up on teams is that balance between the pass and run with John White.
We already talked about Torrey Gurley. If you paid $7,200 for him, he didn't play at all, but we didn't even know that until after the game had started. Luke Tasker and Andy Fantuz, a couple of big players in Hamilton, which we both had ranked a little lower this week, 8,600 and 6,800 respectively. They had a couple of pretty tough matchups, didn't they, down the stats guy?
Yeah, Billy Parker and Javon Johnson. And when we get into the matchups, we'll talk about those guys. But another key to this one is Jeremiah Masoli and Chad Owens have that synergy with each other. That's Masoli's favorite target. And once Zach Claros is back, you're going to see Luke Tasker probably take on that role, as he was Claros' favorite target last season. So for now, it's Owens, but it could shift over to Luke Tasker in a couple weeks.
Skyrocket. His numbers, we anticipate, will go way up when Claros is healthy. Guy's number, who we expected to pile up last week, as he does in each and every week. Duron Carter found himself back in the lineup as his suspension. The appeal is pending, $9,400, and didn't look too great on the numbers.
Well, we'll get into that in the social media segment as far as Duron Carter's disappointment with this Montreal Alouettes offense and with what Anthony Calvillo is calling a disappointing week from him, as he only puts up 8 points, 3 catches for 50 yards, and only 4 targets. And we had talked about the potential for BJ Cunningham and the, chemistry between he and Rakeem Cato, as both have come up together. That was sure enough it, as Cunningham had 8 targets and Carter only 4.
Darvin Adams and Ryan Smith, both pretty low on the side for Winnipeg, mainly just because of Drew Willie. Didn't really have a whole lot of success. And I think more than anything, he's probably just used to getting laid on his back continually, which leads to the happy feet. $7,400 and $7,000 respectively. You didn't get the return you wanted.
Yeah, and Darvin Adams produces 6.8 points. And in the case of Ryan Smith, he has a disappointing 6.6 points. And I think in the case of Smith, who knows, maybe the injury was a little bit more of a factor than we realized, as he's going to be out for a couple of weeks.
Week in and week out, you pretty much figure that Chris Williams is going to be a guaranteed start for you last week because of Greg Ellingson, the numbers and the targets he was getting. Williams dropped off, as we mentioned already. $11,000 you would have paid for him, and $7,600 for Brad Sinopoli.
Yeah, and Williams' value continues to go up as he has an $11,100 value for this week. 13.5 points from Chris Williams, only 6 catches for 63 yards. He added some in the return game, and in the case of Sinopoli, you've talked about how he's a little bit more of a Henry Burris receiver as far as favoriting for targets. He only had 3 targets, 3 catches, 21 yards, and a 5.1 point total on DraftKings.
Also, if you're in long format fantasy, something to look at that keep an eye on when Henry Burris comes back, because you might be able to get a little more of a value to Brad Sinopoli. But hey, Trevor Harris keeps slinging the ball like he has been. Maybe he might stay. Who knows? We'll get to that in a few more weeks. BC Lions were probably the biggest disappointment on defense, as the BC Lions, we thought that they're usually a pretty good defense this year. $5,300 is what you would have paid for them, and they played well enough to win, but on the defensive side, definitely didn't get it done.
Well, it just wasn't enough points there. They got some pressure on Mitchell Gale, but not a whole lot as far as sacks and interceptions or any kind of fumble recoveries. So BC Lions, for them, a fairly pedestrian week with that price tag, as they only put up 5 points on the week.
All right, we've spoken about our fine producer, Dan Heinmarsh, in the past, and our great engineer, Ben Bussey. I want to let you know, Ben does all the editing and the sound effects for our podcast. We appreciate the quality. And our friend producer, Dan, he's known for his soapboxes. And if he had an acting job last week that he's good at accents too. So we thought, why not bring him in for a regular segment week in and week out. Producer Dan, welcome back.
Ted Bentsikas asks, if Glenn plays, do you think Cunningham is still a good value play?
Thanks for the question, Ted. I think that BJ Cunningham is still going to have some value, not as heavy as Rakeem Cato. Glenn likes to favor Nick Lewis as he does Duron Carter, so Cunningham will still be a value until, of course, Kenny Stafford does come back off that 6-game injured list. Then that's when Cunningham could run into some problems. But for this week, Cunningham will still have some value, yes.
Bill Harrell at BillSnake23. Value wide receiver plays due to numerous injuries at wide receiver position?
Yeah, thanks, Billy. We're going to get to that actually right in our next segment. So that one will be exclusively for you, my friend. Thanks for tweeting us.
Coach DeVore at Marauders79. Riley has been getting me good points the past few weeks. Does this trend continue this week?
Well, Roy, Mr. Coach DeVore, a guy I actually know personally, just want to say thanks for the question. This is a matchup that when we get to this towards the end of our show, this is going to be an interesting one because the Hamilton Tiger Cats, they're known for their ferocious defense last season and the year prior. Haven't been that great so far this season, but we think this could be one of their turning point games. No, Mike Riley will not put up 400 and nearly 470 yards this week, but I still think he'll have respectable numbers, but not massive numbers, but he'll still have himself a good week.
Snot and Balls at Selly_ill27. I'd love to hear more about wide receivers and slot backs in Calgary.
Well, we've talked about that in the injury segment of the podcast as far as the injuries go in Calgary, and Joe West will be out this week, and couple that with Lamar Durant coming back into the lineup and Anthony Parker being a little bit banged up. The way I kind of see it playing out, we talked about it already, Greg Wilson will probably get the start. He's the veteran guy coming off the practice roster. I think Dave Dickinson feels a little bit more comfortable with him. Mark-Wade McDaniel is going to get a pile of targets. He did in week 2 against Winnipeg, and he'll continue to do that. He'll continue to be the big target guy for Drew Willie on certain games, and this is a good matchup for him against the young halfbacks from Winnipeg. Another one to watch as far as the weak side slot back is Bakari Grant and Kamar Jordan, and an article came out in the Calgary Herald on Monday regarding this battle by Scott Mitchell of the Calgary Herald, and basically what was said in there by Dave Dickinson is he just sees this every single week being a competition, and you hear about certain teams wanting as much competition as possible. This is a position they want these two guys to push each other as much as possible. So really, you're not going to know on a week-by-week basis who's going to be starting at that weak side slot for the Stampeders until the depth chart comes out. They could go back to Kamar Jordan this week after bringing in Bakari Grant last week, but I assume just based on his performance in the Stampeders' previous game against Ottawa, that Bakari Grant will remain in the lineup, and he'll be a very good play as well, as the Red Blacks have given up a lot of yards to that position. So McDaniel and he probably will be the two primary receivers. And then also Lamar Durant comes into the lineup. I think Durant, he will be a big receiver for the Stampeders, especially by the end of the season. He's a guy they're very excited about. He's a bit of a physical freak, a great big receiver, a big target for Bo Levi Mitchell. I think you're going to see him being a guy as the season goes on and once he gets healthy from this injury. And then finally, Anthony Parker is a little bit more of a guy that plays that strong side wide receiver position. I think you'll see him get some long touchdowns, but as far as consistent targets on a week by week, Anthony Parker is a difficult play on DraftKings.
And in weeks ahead, Kenny Shaw is a guy that maybe you can look at selling high if you're in long format fantasy and kind of pillaging one of your fellow fantasy pool players and getting a good trade and leaving them with nothing, which is what I'm famous for in all of my leagues, which is why nobody wants to trade with me anymore. Follow us at CFL Fantasy FTB on Twitter, and thanks as well to producer Dan for jumping in there. What you don't know is Engineer Ben was actually bench pressing producer Dan as he was reading those. That's how strong Engineer Ben is. A guy who's going to have to develop some arm strength to carry the whole province of Saskatchewan on his back is Mitchell Gale, who's moving to top waiver wire ads, and he's a guy you'll have your eye on this week.
I know in my own league with you, Dave, I don't know if you saw last night, I went out and added Mitchell Gale. As my backup was Logan Kilger, and I have the BC Lions on bye with Jonathan Jennings going on bye. So if you're looking for a starter this week, go and grab Mitchell Gale. He looks like he'll get a few weeks in the starting job for Saskatchewan, get you some added points, and then a second quarterback. One player that we didn't touch on in the injury report, and I don't think it's too serious of a thing, Drew Willie got bumped in practice, so I don't know if his own defense is turning on him. That's a possibility. I don't know, Dave. What do you think? Matt Nichols is the backup in Winnipeg, and if Drew Willie continues to throw ground ball practice to infielders with some of his throws, there could be a real look for Matt Nichols to come in and take over that starting job, but keep an eye on that one in Winnipeg.
Who's also well known for throwing ground balls during the game. So between the two of those, the Bombers are set at quarterback, are they not? The irony is that Drew Willie's in the top 3 in passing yards in the CFL right now, which I just don't really understand. But nonetheless, to go with that, a waiver wire ad, Matt Walter looks to be a little bit banged up, but likely going to be okay going forward. He might start getting a few touches.
Yeah, the Riders got into ratio trouble last week, so they needed a Canadian in the lineup. So Matt Walter went in and got some carries in that Rider offense. If that continues to be the case, you could see him work his way into the offense a little bit more.
Greg Wilson, guy that we were really excited to see, hoping he would have stolen a starting spot right at a training camp in Calgary. And he could, as we mentioned, see game action this week. He's been getting all the first-team reps in place of Joe West due to his ankle injury. Could be the guy in Winnipeg, getting the start this week for the Calgary Stampeders. So if he is, you're going to want to grab him because the Calgary Stampeders, when we get into matchups, likely going to light the Bombers up like a Christmas tree. Nick Dembski, a fellow Winnipegger, got drafted by the Saskatchewan Roughriders, and if Chambers is out going forward, Nick Dembski could be the Canadian, as the Riders don't have a whole lot of them in the lineup. Dembski could be the one getting some targets.
Yeah, and in that case, one part of it to look at, after the injury to Shmad Chambers, John Childs shifted to the strong side receiver spot, and we've talked about that being a difficult place for some quarterbacks to make the throw to. Dembski actually came in a slot back role, so you could see him as a little bit more of a security blanket for Mitchell Gale if Chambers is out long term.
And a great point by Chris Cuthbert and Glenn Suter on the broadcast. Those guys practice on the 2 team together, so already you have developed a chemistry, Mitchell Gale and Nick Dembski, and there's a touchdown pass that he was the recipient of because of that, so a guy that you want to keep your eye on. And Dan mentioned a little bit earlier on Armandi Edwards when we talked about injuries and replacements, the potential for him going forward. No need really to elaborate a lot on him unless Dan's got something to drop in.
No, just keep an eye on that undisclosed injury to John Childs, on how long-term that is.
The only disclosed injury we have is Darian Durant, because if Ryderville didn't know what was wrong with him or right with him, there would be a whole lot of trouble. Wallace Miles in Toronto, a guy you can keep your finger on for a couple of weeks, of course, until Deontay Spencer does look like he's back in the lineup, and Torrey Gurley's health. 4 catches for 31 yards last week for Miles.
Yeah, see what's going on with the status of Torrey Gurley and whether he's in the lineup this week. Phil Bates got a starting position in the slot back for the Argonauts this past week, and he was actually on the depth chart listed ahead of Wallace Miles in that slot back spot. So Phil Bates, looks like the Argos want to give him an opportunity on offense. Unfortunately, he only had 1 catch for 1 yard, so it may not be a huge play, but it could take some time for him to develop chemistry with Ricky Ray.
Guy I know Dan the Stats Guy has been really high on since the start of our show in episode 1. Corbin Laux in Montreal. He had no catches, no receptions, and no yards last week, but he did get an end zone look, which was, surprise, overthrown by Rakeem Cato. So that could be an ad going forward you might want to keep in your back pocket.
Yeah, he's playing that weak side slot back role, and he's a real interesting one on DraftKings because he only comes with that $3,000 value. Kenny Stafford will be on the 6th game, so Laux is in no danger of coming out of the lineup. So just keep an eye on his performance in the next couple weeks here if you are playing long format, because he could potentially be a big play for the Montreal Alouettes.
Thomas Mayo spread it on in Winnipeg with the Ryan Smith injury, a guy we talked about a little bit earlier in the injury segment. Obviously, the offseason signing for the Bombers could be a guy to factor in the offense this week. But again, with the way that they're throwing balls in Winnipeg, I'd be a little more cautious with bomb their receivers these days, wouldn't you?
Yeah, he's a guy that, especially when we talk about that competition with Gerard Shepard, keep a week-by-week look at Mayo. He might be somebody you don't need to add in your league for a couple of weeks.
All right, Ruben Frank has had himself a quietly respectable season. He blocked a punt, I believe, or a field goal, a blocked punt it was, and returned it for a touchdown earlier on for the Eskimos, and 3 tackles and a sack last week. A guy you can take a look at, as you could, Arnaud Gascon-Nadon in Ottawa. Another 2 sacks last week, and he had a fumble recovery too, did he not?
Yeah, he's kind of quietly becoming a big factor on that Ottawa defense. I know for those that purchased our guide, we were really high on Aston Whiteside at the other defensive end spot in Ottawa, but it seems like Gascon-Nadon is really making a big name for himself, and as a Canadian, he's in no danger of coming out of the lineup. Feel free to go after him. Again, one that in my own league I went after and got Gascon-Nadon on my team, and hopefully he can keep continuing this role of sacks.
Took the words right out of my mouth at Aston Whiteside. I drafted him in the other league that Dan isn't in, and I've been suffering with him, absolutely waiting for him to explode. But I had Adrian Tracy on the other side, so hey, nothing wrong with that. He had himself a great game last week as well. Alex Singleton in Calgary, as we talked about Taylor Reid and his injury situation right now, a guy you can look at as adding for this week.
Yeah, and Singleton is the Stampeders, one of their draft picks in the Canadian College Draft this year. Kind of out of necessity. He's going to get a lot of time in the next couple weeks here. And as it goes forward, if they get into any kind of ratio trouble, he could be someone that gets into a starting role. So if you're in a keeper league, this could be a nice keeper for a Canadian.
All right, rounding out the waiver wire ads, trio of defensive backs. Julian Posey had 9 tackles last week, and he looks to be the guy, almost like a DeMond Washington for the Bombers. He'll get a lot of tackles, and quarterbacks will test him quite a bit. So Posey's making himself into a respectable defensive back for the Bombers. As Stephen Clark, we did mention a little bit earlier on with BC, he'll be filling in for the TJ Lee injury. And Stephen Clark, if you're a longtime CFL fan, before he got a look in the NFL, he's a guy with some pedigree.
Yeah, he did very well for the Lions last season, and kind of late in the season really made a name for himself. I'm not sure as far as if there'll be any shifting to any of the positions in the Lions secondary, whether he'll go to one of the corner spots and one of the corners will move inside. We'll see that once the Lions come off their bye week.
Aaron Berry, the starting field corner in Toronto, is another guy you could possibly look at as well as we move into the matchups. This is the part, you know what? We love to interact, as we mentioned in weeks past. We love to interact with our listeners on Twitter. We've had a lot of different questions. We've had a lot of comments, a lot of positive comments as well, guys winning money, et cetera, et cetera. One thing that we are getting a lot of is guys love to hear about the matchups and how we break that down week in and week out. So thank you so much. And I'm going to give the credit to Dan the Stats Guy, who does put a lot of work into these each and every week. Takes you about, 9 hours to put all that together with all of our notes?
Well, it's easy because the depth charts come out and it's really something to watch during the games because we'll get into it in the Saskatchewan matchup with Naaman Roosevelt as an example. We talked about that he'd be seeing a lot of Ronnie Yell last week against the BC Lions. And why did Roosevelt have so much success? If you looked, actually on a lot of plays, the Riders moved Roosevelt over to the middle of the field and played him kind of a little bit more as a slot back, getting him away from Ronnie Yell. So success of certain players can come if they do get away from one of the stronger players. And there's a couple of, not just a couple, there's a number of strong cover guys in this CFL that can really shut down big players.
Hashtag yell hell. Ronnie really got on that, didn't he?
He loved that
right.
After the game and gave us a retweet. So if Ronnie, if you're listening, we'll keep going with the yell hell if you keep producing those types of games.
There's going to be some HELL in Winnipeg this week, I'll tell you that much. Game number 1, Thursday, 7:30 Eastern Time. The Calgary Stampeders will roll into Bomberville, and in years past, it hasn't been a friendly matchup for them. Bo Levi Mitchell threw for 309 yards in Week 2, as the Stamps put up 516 total yards against the Bombers. So I'm not going to give anything away because our DraftKings rankings, our DFS rankings come out tomorrow. Bo Levi Mitchell's probably going to have a pretty high ranking. I'm just going to say that.
That's pretty safe to say, and I think for a lot of people, especially with the dollar value, his value obviously has gone up coming into the week. Based, I think, probably looking at this matchup with the Bombers and his previous success against that Bomber defense. So, as in the case of Bo Levi Mitchell, this $9,800 value, almost to $10,000 now. Not quite to the level of $11,000 of Harrison Riley, but still maybe a little bit of a value there.
There's one team that Marquay McDaniel loves playing. It's the Bombers. He seems to have, as a guy growing up in Winnipeg and watching the Bombers for a couple of years, I've been very aware that when Marquay McDaniel goes in to Winnipeg, he has success. He's matched up against Julian Posey this week. He had 7 catches on 12 targets for $116 and a touchdown in Week 2 against Winnipeg. Follow that up with a 10-target game in Week 3. So if the Bombers are going to slow down the Stamps offense right now, Bo Levi is heavy on number 16.
Yeah, and the Bombers are going to need to be quite physical on McDaniel. I saw that in the Ottawa game. He tends to be one of those guys you can get under his skin. If they are able to be a little bit physical with him, maybe someone like Macho Harris sends in an extra shot. Maybe that can shut down McDaniel.
Kamar Jordan or Bakari Grant is matched up against Kevin Fogg, and that slot back battle, as Dan alluded to a little bit earlier on in the show, could be a big value play, a highly targeted position each and every week, and Kevin Fogg is asserting himself as a pretty good defensive back in Winnipeg as well.
Well, he started at that cornerback position, and teams seem to pick on him a little bit, but in this one, because of the cheap value, I could see either one of these guys, whether it is Jordan or Grant, having a big day against Kevin Fogg. So watch for those guys. They could have big targets this week.
Greg Wilson or DeVaris Daniels will make their season debut, likely get CJ Roberts, with Chris Randall getting some duty in there too. So we'll see how that gets favored into everything.
Yeah, we talked to Darren Bauming from TSN Radio about how the Bombers use Chris Randall, and it seems like on certain packages they will roll him to the weak side of the field, but for the most part it is CJ Roberts that will get those receivers, and Chris Randall will match up a little bit more with Anthony Parker.
Lamar Durant or Simone Charbonneau-Campeau is going to get Mo Leggett, and Mo Leggett is really making him a name for himself. He's been a long-time great defender in Winnipeg, and that's going to be a matchup that likely be a tough one for Lamar Durant.
Yeah, and Durant, it looks like he'll be back in the lineup, and with that matchup with Mo Leggett, a very physical cover guy himself. Durant is a big receiver. It should be a fun one to watch, but I think Leggett has the ability to stay with Durant.
Anthony Parker against Chris Randall. And, sometimes CJ Roberts could sprinkle in there as well. And we've said Parker did miss practice, so we're not really sure whether he's going to come in this week or not. But if he does, he'll be matched up against either one of those guys.
Yeah, and again with that, Chris Randall's not the type of guy that's going to get burnt deep very often. And one thing with this, Chris Randall obviously is a former Stampeder, so he knows Anthony Parker very well from their time practicing against each other. So he'll know his tendencies. And I don't have this as a very favorable matchup for the Canadian.
And And Chris Randall? Yeah, he's a guy who's known to pull one down and read a quarterback's eyes from time to time. And Bo Levi Mitchell has had a bit of a paradise run, so maybe he might be able to pull one down. He single-handedly kept the Bombers in that game in Week 2 against Calgary. Jerome Messam, that game against the Bombers in Week 2, ran for $137. And to go along with that, his counterpart also seems to be splitting the carries as well.
Yeah, on the red zone, it seems like Torrey Harrison is going to continue to vulture some red zone TDs. In that Bomber game, he came in and got a TD from short yardage at both the 4-yard line, I think. Maybe it was even closer. It might have been about the 2. Last week, or 2 weeks ago, against Ottawa, Harrison was the one who came in on the red zone with the red zone team in overtime. So it seems like when the ball is on, or when the game is on the line and the Stampeders are in that red zone, Harrison could continue to vulture red zone TDs from Jerome Messam.
And if you're in long format fantasy football, I had a conversation with one of our listeners today that Torrey Harrison is a guy that he's consistently going to get touches week in and week out. He's consistently going to bring in points. He's a guy that you're going to want to have on your roster because a lot of running backs do come in and out, have injuries. Torrey Harrison is a guy, regardless of the situation with Messam, regardless of how many touches he has, you don't see that as often in other teams where like a 2 running back system, for instance, in BC or in Saskatchewan or even in Edmonton with Shakir Bell we have yet to see this year. Torrey Harrison will continually find himself in the lineup in Calgary. As we move on to the Winnipeg side of things, Drew Willie, he's the garbage man. What did Matt Dunnigan call it? AB. He gets all of his points AB after the beatdown. I love that one. Matt Dunnigan, he's a great guy to listen to, but that's where Drew Willie's finding a lot of his points and a lot of his stats, and that's what happened in that Week 2 matchup against Calgary. He ended up finishing with almost 400 yards through the air. Likely won't be a repeat performance this week.
Yeah, a lot of that, like you said, in garbage time, and a lot of that in checkdowns to Andrew Harris, where Harris, it seemed, would get the ball and take off with it for big runs. So for the Bombers, I think, if they're to have success, they're going to want to get Willie and Harris to get those earlier than in the fourth quarter.
Weston Dressler is a guy to look at. He started out the weak side wide receiver. Last week he showed up in the depth chart as a strong side slot where he played his whole career in Saskatchewan. This could be the big difference in a matchup, which could be a big one because there's some good shutdown guys in Calgary.
Yeah, on one side, if he starts at the receiver spot, there's Fred Bennett, the veteran corner, and he struggled with speed guys this year. You look back to Chris Williams' big performance against the Stampeders a couple weeks ago. That was against Fred Bennett. And then if he is in the slot, then he probably will get Brandon Smith, another veteran halfback from the Stampeders. Either way, I think Dressler is the key, especially with Ryan Smith being out. But the other one that I think is another big I guess sleeper you could call him, but he does have a bit of a big value, is Darvin Adams, because Adams will be the flip side of that. Adams is the one that goes back and forth with Dressler, whether it is into the strong side slot or at the weak side receiver. You could see Adams potentially in a matchup with either Bennett or Smith, and with that, I think Adams I see as a little bit more of the guy that you want to target this week. Jace Davis, the Bombers' other strong side slot back, is going to get Joe Burnett, and Burnett has the speed to keep up with Jace Davis. I don't think that you're going to see him go for many big plays like you have in past weeks. So I think as far as this week goes, Darvin Adams is going to be the big target guy for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, just because of his size and his ability to go after those, I guess, long in the tooth Stampeders DBs.
And we did mention before, Ryan Smith out, Thomas Mayo is going to come in there. Or Gerard Shepard. Thomas Mayo had 5 catches for 78 yards in that one game against the Stampeders in the Battle of the Condiments, which I love. Jerron Mayo versus Thomas Mayo. Gerard Shepard could find his way there. We've talked about that 2 or 3 times already, so no need to beat that to death. Rory Collard will see Tommy Campbell. Oh boy, is that a tough matchup, because Tommy Campbell, and right from the start of the year, Scott Mitchell getting his second name mentioned from the Calgary Sun, he did call that right in training camp that Tommy Campbell is going to be a beast on the corner for the Stampeders, and Rory Collard isn't going to have a whole lot of fun matched up against him. Andrew Harris, he struggled on the ground against the Stampeders in Week 2. only 16 yards and 8 carries. However, they did screen it to him quite a bit, so that might be where they'll need to rely on. And I think with Drew Willie or Matt Nichols, whoever's playing quarterback, likely the only way they're going to move the ball is probably going to be through Andrew Harris in that game. So that's your Calgary-Winnipeg matchup. Moving into Friday night, Ottawa and Saskatchewan. And I would say one of the ones I'm most excited about this week because there are a lot of, I feel like there's two extremes right now. Those who think the Saskatchewan Roughriders are still the 2015 Riders that are absolutely terrible, and those that are firm believers in this team will be a dominant team in a few weeks. Could this game be a turning point? Could this be the turning point right now?
Well,
this would be a statement.
Yeah, this is one where it really, we sent out the tweet late in the Saskatchewan game that they were playing Ottawa this week, and was anybody bold enough to say Saskatchewan was going to beat Ottawa? And a lot of jokes back of not a chance, not happening. Who knows? Anything can happen at that Mosaic Stadium. We've seen Rocky Butler win a Labor Day Classic against the Winnipeg Blue Bombers however many years ago. A guy that was a third-string quarterback and nobody had
2002, I believe that was.
Yeah, and so anything can happen at Mosaic Stadium. It's a crazy place to play if you haven't experienced it, either if you're a Canadian fan or an American fan. It's an intimidating place to play. But on the Red Black side, they've thrown for 395, 396, and 392 yards in the past 3 games with Trevor Harris as the signal caller. Meanwhile, the Rough Riders defense has surrendered 378 yards and 429 yards. So, it's easy to just look at those numbers and really write off the Rough Riders right from the start. And the first one right there, Chris Williams, he will be the number 1 receiver for us on our weekly rankings as he's back in the spotlight, facing a veteran cornerback in Buddy Jackson. And we decided to do a little bit of research on that, looking back to last season when Jackson was still with the Calgary Stampeders and they were matched up. Chris Williams had 7 catches, 162 yards, and a touchdown in that game. So after a 1-week break, not the week to fade Chris Williams. Go back to him. An $11,200 value this week. Keeps climbing, but keep going with Chris Williams.
And a guy that, if you had last week, long format or DraftKings, you were a happy guy. Greg Ellingson had a massive week in week number 4. And him and Trevor Harris, as we mentioned already, have a little bit of chemistry there. He's going to be up against Brandon McDonald, his former teammate, and Brian Burnham of the BC Lions put up over 100 against McDonald last week. So Greg Ellingson, look for him to have some more of that successful performance again this week. In a matchup I'm pretty curious of. I like this matchup for a number of reasons. Ernest Jackson against Ed Gainey. And Ed Gainey has been struggling quite a bit this season, but Ernest Jackson also has been putting the numbers up that we'd expect, or many would expect that he should.
Well, Ed Gainey's got a lot of flack, and last week he proved why he plays defense. There was a couple that he could have picked off from Jonathan Jennings. Emmanuel Arsenault was targeted 15 times, but he only had 6 catches, Dave. And I know that you're down on Gainey, but you have to give him a lot of credit there because Emmanuel Arsenault is an elite receiver at the CFL, and for him to only have 6 catches on 15 targets, something had to be going right for Gainey.
Ed Gainey likely going to be a product of, will he stay in the lineup when Darius Brooks is back from injury? Who knows? Dan and I could debate that until probably December, but we'll leave that one for another podcast. Brad Sinopoli is going to be going up against Otha Foster. Sinopoli already targets have been dropping, and Otha Foster was victimized in plays in back-to-back weeks. And Corey Watson and Nick Moore doesn't really have the same usage as Henry Burris, the relationship with Brad Sinopoli, as does Trevor Harris, but you never know. Sinopoli's still good for a second and long ball, and they might be able to catch Foster sleeping.
Yeah, don't expect double-digit targets from Brad Sinopoli, but he could be someone that kind of goes underneath the coverage and gets a key first down for the Red Blacks, but not much beyond that.
Jake Hardy is up against Johnny Dixon, as Dan alluded to earlier into the podcast. Justin Cox is out of the lineup. And Dixon could be challenged by Hardy. He does see a ball here and there. And if you're looking for a deep sleeper, if you're in a long format, or if, in the DraftKings format there, Jake Hardy is the guy you could look at that might be able to blitz the Riders defense for a big play. Who knows?
You could see Trevor Harris kind of go after Johnny Dixon on, early in the game. And the thing with Jake Hardy only comes with that $3,200 value. He could be someone that the Rough Riders, they think that they've slept on kind of, and suddenly he takes off for a deep pass from Trevor Harris and makes a big name of himself after missing, I guess it was all of last season or the majority of last season. So basically this is his freshman season in the CFL.
We have a number of CFL players who follow the show, one of those being Nick Grigsby. And this is a matchup that I would really focus on and I would really study hard, is Nick Grigsby against a very physical, very aggressive, very seek and destroy front seven that is only going to get tougher and tougher and tougher as the weeks do wear on. And Nick Grigsby hasn't really hit that full game shape yet, obviously coming back at a car sales and into the backfield for the Ottawa Redblacks. So could we see Nick Grigsby get a little bit banged up in this game and maybe leave the game early? We haven't seen him play full 60 minutes yet, or a full series of snaps. He's sat out a few here and there. So Grigsby, I would be a little bit cautious on if I were an owner.
Yeah, and one thing with the Rough Riders defense, I know you showed me some tweets from Monday afternoon, just from a BC Lions fan about the Riders' performance. We sent out a tweet on Monday morning with regard to the Rough Riders' performance already this season. They're number 1 in the league on second and long, and he plays over 7 yards. And I think, like you said earlier, I think a lot of people see this Rough Riders defense as the same old. And BC put up 40 points from them, but that is a rarity with the Chris Jones defense. I think the last time that I think it was the last time he had given up 40 points was 5 years ago. I might have read that wrong, but I read that in one of the newspapers that it's been a long time since a Chris Jones defense gave up 40 plus points. Chris Jones hasn't forgotten how to coach defense. Was sort of the response that we gave to that, because you look at Mark Washington in BC. The BC Lions gave up a 50 spot in the middle of the season last year, and they recovered to be a decent defense by the end of the year and already have shown that they can be a pretty good defense this year. As far as the Riders defense go, you look at numbers like that. If they're the number 1 defense against plays like second and long and are going to be holding teams on second down to limited yardage, that to me, once they start to gel together as a unit and start to get the right personnel and the right groupings together, they're going to be a scary defense by the end of the season.
Jeff Knox Jr., he's not even a starter, but is he the only remaining defensive starter for the Riders turnover from last season? I'm looking at their front seven going, okay, Greg Jones new, Aguavin new, on and on and on you go down the roster. It's a complete turnover, a whole new batch of players. They're going to be respectable in a punishing defense in a number of weeks. And if you want to challenge us on that, that's cool. Hey, nobody's perfect, but we can go down through our fantasy guide and tell you about all the predictions we made correct in the past. So, hey, we love the questions. We love for you to challenge us on things because that only makes us better. But the Saskatchewan Roughriders, I'll tell you right now, I said it in January. I tweeted it back in January when everyone was panicking when John Chick and Weston Dressler got released and the sky was falling. People were burning their combines and running their way out of Riderville. I said the Saskatchewan Roughriders will be 9-9 this year. I guarantee it. And I still firmly believe in that. They might even be better than that. They're going to have a great defense. So thank you very much for the question. Continue to challenge us on these things. That's fine. But you know what? Be respectful about it. Nobody wants a peeing match. Can I say that? Nobody wants to, get to butthurt on Twitter.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Let's get back to business here as we move in to that matchup. The other side of the ball, Saskatchewan Roughriders. Mitch Gale gets his start, and a guy who's been released and added back on from time to time again. He's got a bit of a depleted receiver group, and he faces a hungry secondary for the Red Blacks. What could that look like?
Well, in the case of Naaman Roosevelt, there could be an interesting matchup there. Jonathan Rose has typically started at that weak side corner, but with the signing of Mitchell White, I don't know if it's going to be this week or next week, or if he's even going to play the weak side, or if they'll keep Rose there. That's going to be one to watch for in the depth charts, whether Jonathan Rose starts on the weak side, so the left side of the page, or if Mitchell White goes there. Also in the mix, obviously, on the strong side of the field, is Forrest Hightower, and I just in my notes here, Dave, I know I have Nick Dembski down at that receiver spot. It looks like Dembski would probably shift to the inside. So if it's John Childs or Amani Edwards or Rob Begg has played the strong side receiver for much of his career. So there could be a number of different scenarios as far as the Rough Riders offense and the Red Blacks defense here. But Rose, White, and Forrest Hightower, also Tristan Jackson in the mix, could be any of the four corners starting for the Red Blacks on the outside. But in the case of Naaman Roosevelt, he's going to be a big target guy. You saw that in the second half from Mitchell Gale. He trusts Naaman Roosevelt, so he's going to continue to use Naaman Roosevelt regardless of where he lines up on the field.
I know a lot of Saskatchewan fans fell in love with Ricky, go Ricky, after his big performance a couple weeks ago. But as we said, as the question came down, don't be totally sold on this guy. He'll get some targets, but he's not going to get you big targets each and every week. And oh boy, does he ever have a tough test ahead of him this week. And number 14, the hair attack.
Yeah, Abdul Kane lines up across from Ricky Collins. And I think with this one, Kane is a very physical defensive back. You've seen him in past weeks give guys the business after the play or take questionable penalties, but he's going to be in a receiver's face. And I really like this matchup for Ricky Collins, surprisingly. As good as a cover guy as Abdul Kane is, Ricky Collins, I see him as a bigger receiver that will be up to the up to the battle. We talked about it last week. He had Ryan Phillips, and the reason that Collins didn't get a whole lot last week is that Darian Durant wasn't going to look at Ryan Phillips. You can say whatever you want about that's some sort of old wives' tale or whatever else. It happened last week. Ryan Phillips didn't get any looks. Ricky Collins didn't get any looks. This week, Ricky Collins will probably get looks against Abdul Kane, so be comfortable with Ricky Collins. He'll be the number 2 guy for Mitchell Gale.
Abdul Kane will also take pass interference penalties, so Collins could get some receptions on that side. I'll add that on there. But yeah, that's a good matchup. Rob Begg against Antoine Pernot. That's going to be an interesting one. He was very dominant last week against the Alouettes, and Rob Begg he's that guy that, I love the line that Suter threw out as well. You can have your team full of all-stars, but you need your Rob Beggs. And Rob Begg gets it done no matter what the matchup is. Rob Begg seems to get a couple key catches every week.
Well, I think, and we've talked about, the Nick Lewises, the Nick Lewises or the, in other teams, the Corey Watsons in Edmonton or the Brad Sinoplis in Ottawa. These guys are safety valves for their quarterbacks if they're looking for a first down on 2nd and 5, for example. And I think in the case of Mitchell Gale, he's a young quarterback making his first start for the Rough Riders. He's going to need somebody that he can depend on to make tough catches over the middle field. That'll be Rob Begg. If the Rough Riders are going to have any kind of success, Rob Begg is going to have a lot of targets.
Nick Dembski, as we did mention, Dan mentioned right off the top when talking about different targets, the matchups. You could see a number of potential matchups. And because Dembski is starting, Kendall Lawrence looks like he's going to stay right in return duties. And I know a number of you have fell in love with Kendall Lawrence over the years, and especially Chris Jones. He's a big fan of him. Kendall Lawrence doesn't look like he's going to be seeing a lot of field in favor of Nick Dembski.
Well, and actually on that, it actually could benefit Kendall Lawrence if Dembski is on the offense full time. Sorry, with my cold here. Nick Dembski has kind of split the return duties with Kendall Lawrence, and if Dembski does move into the offense full time, I think Chris Jones will try to protect him, and so Kendall Lawrence could see more returns and more yards that way. But yeah, as far as the offense goes, you really haven't seen Kendall Lawrence at all.
Curtis Steele didn't have a lot of fun last week at running back for the Riders. Likely won't have a whole lot of fun this week. He'll get some checkdowns. He had some issues catching the ball to the backfield against the Argos early in the season, but those have seemed to subsided. But we don't expect massive numbers out of Curtis Steele this week, but still should be respectable.
Yeah, one thing to watch for that also is that offensive line and their health with the Rough Riders. The key names being, of course, Dan Clark and Brendan Labatt.
Saturday night, welcome to my house. Flow Rider playing the halftime show, the Hamilton Ticats and the Eskimos. There's a big name right there, and congrats to the folks in the Edmonton Eskimos for reeling that one in. Hamilton, looking at it. Ken Austin, he's sticking with Jeremiah Mazzoli. He's his guy, the former Eskimo. He's going to say Doesn't matter what it is. He's going to learn to protect the ball. And if he's going to protect the ball, he's going to have to run the ball. So they're going to stick with Jeremiah Masoli this week again.
Yeah, 2 more weeks until Zach Collaros. According to Matthew Shinetti of TSN, it looks like that first week of August is when Collaros will make his return. So this will be the last start for Masoli before the Ticats go to their bye week. Again, don't expect Masoli to be very aggressive. Expect him to be quite conservative. So because of that Edmonton offense, Dave, I don't know if the Edmonton offense can be low fuel and conservative, but there was a lot of people ticked off about that Hamilton-Montreal game with how conservative the offenses were and how many 2-and-outs there were.
Well, a guy who's going to be conservative in weeks ahead, but for now, he's going to see some balls. Chad Owens is going to be matched up against Cord Parks. And earlier on in the season, we've hit on him hard. I'm sorry. Chad Owens is my soapbox guy. I mentioned at the start of the year, he's not a 1,000-yard receiver anymore, but because of the relationship with Jeremiah Masoli, Chad Owens is going to see some balls. And looks like, when Weston Dressler was matched up against him, Cord Parks, earlier in the season, or last week rather, had 7 catches for 63 yards on 10 targets. So Chad Owens likely going to see a couple more weeks of some heavy targets before Zach Collaros comes back. Then it's all the Luke Tasker show.
Yeah, that's kind of what we've talked about as far as Tasker going with him. He probably was doing cartwheels when he got the news that Collaros will be back after the bye week. But again, for Tasker, he doesn't have the place to be worthy of an $8,200 value on DraftKings. I'm going to stay away from Tasker this week, also with his matchup against the veteran Marcel Young.
Andy Fantuz will be matched up against Kenny Ladler. Many expected a big game out of Jace Davis last week, but only 3 for 30. Yeah, Ladler, kind of that Sam linebacker spot, really has turned some heads so far. Had a great opening week for the Eskimos. And Fantuz wants a bit of a bounce back week. He only had 18 yards last week and a couple of catches, so he's still the number 2 target, however, in place of Chad Owens.
Yeah, that seems to be the way. And also last week, it seemed like Gable was also a target in there. It sort of seemed like it went Owens, maybe Underwood, then Gable, then Fantuz, then Tasker. It seemed like Fantuz and Tasker, guys that traditionally would be the bigger target guys. For Masoli, he's looking for maybe a little bit more of a safety play. And obviously Owens is going to be his first look on some of the slant patterns. So Fantuz against Ladler, it could be a decent matchup for Fantuz, and I would still keep him ahead of Tasker and Underwood, but not an amazing week from Andy Fantuz.
Yeah, and Luke Tasker, as you did mention, matched up against Young at $8,200. Probably something you shouldn't be heavily targeting on because he won't be heavily targeted. Underwood and Watkins battle the big guys. Underwood, love that hair. Ticats, if they do abandon the short conservative game, Underwood could see some deep patterns. And you know what? We whipped on Underwood a little bit in his drops a couple weeks back. He had a nice bounce back game last week. So Underwood could be respectable this week against Pat Watkins.
Yeah, you could see that, especially if the Ticats get down early and they do actually have to sling the ball out. Underwood could be the first guy that they go to in that weak side receiver spot. Matched up against Pat Watkins, you could see Underwood try to beat him with his speed and get a deep pattern. So if you're looking for kind of somebody that maybe fills out your roster and maybe you're looking for someone to take a gamble on, if the Ticats do get down early against Edmonton, and again, really, we've talked about that Hamilton defense maybe being a little bit more of a shutdown group. They had a great week last week, so maybe this may not come at all, Dave. This is something I asked of you. What kind of week is Mike Riley going to have? And you said he could have 200 yards, he could have 400 yards. It's a really tough week for him to have a prediction on.
Yeah, Mike Riley, that Hamilton defense, I firmly believe, it's funny what a mindset can do. And I think that in sports, a lot of times, there's momentum, there's whatever, and people say that, you play better for a certain goaltender in hockey, you play better for a quarterback in football. And I firmly believe the Hamilton Tiger Cats and the knowledge that Zach Collaros, the knowledge that he's coming back on the field, brings them all together going, oh boy, we get this thing rolling. When Zach Collaros comes back, I'm telling you right now, the Hamilton Tiger Cats are a different team with Zach Collaros at the helm. So as the Edmonton Eskimos get this Ticats team moving in this week, I firmly believe they're going to be a harder team to play against. I look at Mike Riley at about maybe 290, about 300 this week, maybe 2 touchdowns and a pick, something like that. So in numbers, again, price tag is $11,000 this week. That might not be one that we'll look at, but when we release our DraftKings rankings tomorrow, we can talk all about that. A minuscule matchup, Spencer Watt against Dion Blue. Watt had 2 for 30 last week. He's not a guy that there's better value for better numbers out there. It's pretty much all I have to say about that.
Well, and Watt will see value go up when Collaros goes back, having a quarterback that can maybe go after the strong side of the field a little bit better than Masoli. And one other name, obviously, with the Ticats to consider as a receiving option in DraftKings, back-to-back weeks of returns, I think it was, or it might be 2 and 3 weeks. I'm trying to remember when the first return was, but Brandon Banks returns another punt for a touchdown this past week in Montreal. He continues his strong play in the return game. For him, he's also seeing a little bit of time on the offense. This is another one. If the Ticats get down early and they need some trick plays, Banks could get in there. So with I believe $6,000 value, $6,700 value. He started out the season at $6,000. His value continues to climb and climb. He's almost at the level of Andy Fantus as far as his value goes. So, that's one where, as far as the returns go, that seems like a lot of people are getting rewarded by Brandon Banks' returns to fuel their teams to money victories on DraftKings.
We alluded to earlier on, CJ Gable might have a little bit of success as Jeremiah Masoli will look to stretch the defense a little bit, or open up the defense rather, and hand the ball off to him a little bit more, as the Ticats don't normally run the ball. Different matchups here. Darrell Walker is going to be up against Quinton Pointer, who's making a name for himself earlier on in the season. And Darius Bowman against Johnny Sears Jr., a couple of difficult matchups there.
Yeah, and I think as far as that goes, as far as attacking, I'd rather have a Darius Bowman against Johnny Sears than Quinton Pointer on Darrell Walker. I think Walker got his value late in the game against Winnipeg, but this Hamilton defense is going to be wrapped up. I just can't see a whole lot. Riley might get yards, but I don't see, as far as the plays that are getting Walker points so far this season, any kind of big plays from him. So you want to go with the big target guy, and that's Darius Bowman.
Guys that probably won't get a lot of yards, Chris Getzlaff against Emmanuel Davis. There's a shutdown there. Corey Watson is up against Rico Murray. Another tough matchup. And Nate Kuhorn gets Travis Lee this weekend.
Yeah, Lee almost had the interception last week in Montreal, if not for a penalty against the Hamilton defense. He gets Nate Kuhorn. That should be an interesting matchup to watch.
Nate Kuhorn has said he wants to be a great receiver. He's had a couple of drops in the end zone in the past couple of weeks. This could be his test to try and turn it up this weekend. John White is going to get a big part of the offense. He'll be matched up against Simone Lawrence and Larry Dean, so probably won't have a whole lot of success running the ball this weekend. That's a pretty tough defensive front to take a look at if you're John White. Even though he's got the talent, but John White could be a guy to maybe avoid this week as well. And the final matchup, a Monday Night Football battle. Toronto and Montreal. In Toronto, hopefully get some more fans out there as well. Kevin Glenn back at practice. He'll see the field, quote unquote. I love that. Yeah, we can beat that to death and have some fun with that joke. So he'll likely be at the controls on Monday. Duron Carter is going to be matched up against A.J. Jefferson. A.J. back in the lineup. He's healthy. This could be an interesting move for the Alouettes to try and attack A.J. Jefferson, because he knows how to attack the football.
Well, according to Duron Carter, his girlfriend says that, I forget the exact wording of it, but in the Montreal Gazette, Carter was quoted as saying that his girlfriend, I forget the exact wording, but just wasn't impressed with how he was being used in the offense. It didn't have a whole lot of creativity or something along those lines. I think usually when you see guys that say I'm not getting used enough, they generally will get used the following week. We talked about Jerome Messam already and had his little tantrum on the bench. He had a big game against Winnipeg the following week. So Duron Carter against A.J. Jefferson. I think Montreal will be creative with Carter and maybe move him around the field a little bit to get him away from Jefferson.
As long as we don't see Chris Carter come flying on the sidelines and start coaching receivers again, because I don't think anybody wants to see that, even though that would have been entertaining to watch. As that story did come out this week after that last game. That's kind of a funny one. So BJ Cunningham, he, as we alluded earlier on, he's in there because of the Stafford injury, and Cunningham is matched up against Isaiah Green, who's quickly asserting himself as a huge shutdown defender for the Argos.
Yeah, Isaiah Green, you've been big on him. Cunningham obviously was a big target guy for the Alouettes last week, getting 8 targets. It might not be as good of a matchup for him. I think that Kevin Glenn also likes to go to his guy, Nick Lewis, and you talk about Deron Carter and his need to be used on the offense. I think BJ Cunningham could go down just a little bit.
All right, an interesting matchup. Nick Lewis against Keon Raymond, a couple of former teammates, longtime Stampeders, and Keon Raymond is a guy that he likes to do his homework, and I'm pretty sure he knows all of Nick Lewis's tricks.
Yeah, and that's going to be a fun one to watch. Two guys that have been in the league for, seems like, over a decade. So them head-to-head, it's going to be something to watch. And I think, obviously Kevin Glenn likes to go to him. Keon Raymond could maybe also, a former teammate of Kevin Glenn, maybe he could jump in front of Kevin Glenn's, one of his passes, and take it to the house.
He's been known to do that before. He did it last year when Kevin Glenn was a BC Lion, or a couple years back, pardon me. So he's been in the hip pocket. He can do that. Sam Giguere gets Aaron Barry. Corbin Laux will get matched up against TJ Heath. And if he's ready to go, Devin Smith or maybe even Josh Mitchell if he's healthy. And Brandon Rudley on the ground, especially through the air, looks like he could get some big points, especially with some of those injuries on the interior to Toronto.
Yeah, he was the third most targeted guy for the Owls last week after Cunningham and Lewis, and we've talked about his ability to catch passes through the air. Kevin Glenn will use him. One other note with the Alouettes, Sam Giguere was used in the return game last week against who did Montreal play last week? Hamilton, there we go. Yeah, Hamilton, the game that we had touched on being a little bit of a dud. Sam Giguere getting a little bit more use in the return game, so there might be added value for Giguere as well.
All right, we've exhausted the Toronto Argonauts to death on this podcast already, so we'll blow through here. A big matchup is Vidal Hazelton against Jonathan Mincy. Oh boy.
Vidal Hazelton does get a favorable matchup here, and again, we've touched on it, Torrey Gurley's health. If he's out of the lineup, more and more targets for Hazelton, and especially in that matchup where Mincy guys have got yardage against him, watch for Hazelton this week.
All right, Torrey Gurley against Ethan Davis. We talked about that if Gurley is in the lineup. Kenny Shaw against Billy Parker. Phil Bates gets Javon Johnson. Which ones do you like?
Well, we've talked about Billy Parker and Javon Johnson being real shutdown guys, so I don't like Phil Bates especially. Kenny Shaw should get the targets. If Gurley is out of the lineup, it really depends because he had 11 targets and hauled in 7 passes. If Ricky Ray is in, he may go after those young cornerbacks in Montreal with Torrey Gurley. So watch for Gurley's health. If he's in, go to Gurley. If he's out, go to Shaw.
All right, and rounding out these matchups, a guy that we've tried to be high on in the past and for whatever reason just can't fit into the Argos offense, Anthony Coombs. He's going to get Chip Cox, as is Andre Dury. So, yeah, totally avoid completely. And Brandon Whitaker is one that has been beat down with a little bit of injuries in the past, but he stays healthy. He gets Bear Woods is going to be out of the lineup. So CJ Gable actually did some damage against them last week. So Brandon Whitaker could do all right this week for the Argos.
Well, it looks like Woods is going to be in the lineup with his leg injury. So if he is beat up, you could see Whitaker take advantage of that. And so it could be a decent play again for Whitaker. But be careful again. We've said it on past podcasts. If you're looking in long format leagues, don't fall in love with what Whitaker's done these last couple of weeks and suddenly think that he's vintage Brandon Whitaker. It's a week by week thing, and he has again a favorable matchup with the Montreal Alouettes this week.
All right. We've taken a lot of feedback over past weeks about how much you love the podcast, you love the format, you love the marathons, you love the in-depth matchups. So we're glad that we get that kind of feedback. That pretty much wraps that up. Any final thoughts at all for tonight, Mr. Dan the Stats Guy?
Well, as we have alluded to, those injuries are going to be big things going forward. And, once we're reaching this 6-game part, you're starting to see guys that are going on the 6-game list at the start of the year, like a guy like Deontay Spencer, come off the 6-game list. So if you're playing that DraftKings format, what I think might be the best advice for you right now to do is go on, find out when guys went on the 6-game list. You can go on to CFL.ca, go on to the news drop-down menu. There's transactions. On there, you're able to see what day the guy was put on the 6-game injured list. So, for example, a guy like Deontay Spencer, he'll come off the 6-game injured list if he is healthy after the 6th game. that's where you might get an advantage as far as ownership percentage on DraftKings for a guy like that. So keep an eye on those as far as those go. That's where we're getting our information from as far as injuries and when guys are coming off the injury list.
All right, producer Dan and engineer Ben have been arm wrestling. It looks like Ben has actually ripped his arm off and started beating producer Dan with it. But we'll hopefully be able to add them to the injury list and hopefully get some attention to that. Thanks to producer Dan. Thanks to engineer Ben. Dan, the stats guy, is still healthy? How's the chest? Is it on the 6th game?
Yeah, I might have to go on to the 6th game. Battling a little bit of a cold here the last week or so. So hopefully you got through my voice breaking up throughout the podcast. But I'll battle through. You won't see me complain about any kind of injury.
All right, put some saran wrap over your ears, I suppose. All right. Follow us on Twitter at CFL Fantasy FTB, at Dan_UK1, myself at Dave Dawson7. Thanks as well, producer Dan and engineer Ben, as we had mentioned before. You can follow us on Google Play. 5-star ratings, please. As producer Dan always says, we're available on iTunes, we're available on SoundCloud, TuneIn, Stitcher, and on YouTube. Revolution Engine, lower your weapons, will bring us into the evening again. Episode 10 was a fun one. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.